Thank you for that introduction, Leonie. My name, as Leonie mentioned, is Nuala Madigan. I have been working with the Irish Peatland Conservation Council for almost 15 years. And my main role in the organisation has been Environmental Education Officer. As Leonie mentioned, I've travelled north, south, east and west on the island of Ireland, where I'm joining you from today, raising awareness of the variety of ecosystem services our wild bogs offer us. Today, what we're going to do is have a little exploration of the Dutch and Irish bog story. When I joined the Irish Peatland Conservation Council, I remember in my interview, I was asked, what do I know about the Dutch and Irish bog story? And shamefully, my answer was that both the Netherlands and Ireland had bogs, and that was the limit to what I knew about the Dutch and Irish bog story. So very quickly, I set about doing an exhibition celebrating 25 years of the Dutch and Irish bog story. A little bit about the Irish Peatland Conservation Council. If I just try and change the slide, bear with me. There we go. So we are a national charity in Ireland. We were established by a group of students and lecturers in 1982 in University College Dublin. We were really established as to begin a discussion about Irish peatlands. And in 1986, we were formally established a company with limited guarantee at the time, and our charity number 6829. Our mission was, and still is today, is to conserve a representative sample of Irish peatlands for people to enjoy today and in their future. Our work involves peatland restoration, conservation, research, and awareness raising of the value of bogs. In the short time we have today, I can't go through all the different elements of the charity's work in Ireland. So we do have a website, www.ipcc.ie, where you can learn more about our charity and our work in Ireland. And you can see there on the screen, this is our headquarters, the Bog Nature Centre. We moved into the centre in 2005, and the centre is located in the heart of the bogs in the Midlands of Ireland. And it was always a great mission of the charities to move from our Dublin location to the Midlands, to where our boglands are. And moving to the Bog Nature Centre, it has been a great achievement of the charities, and also it brought us right into the heart of Irish peatlands. So with the time we have, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction into what I learned about the Dutch and Irish bog story. Many of you joining us here today might know a lot about this story, but it's a really special one where two countries came together to explore, understand, research, and ultimately to conserve peatland habitat. And it's a really inspiring story that I love to share with people. We have a shared history in peat exploitation, as with many other European countries and indeed countries around the world. We've always focused on the provisioning services of peatlands, so what was found beneath them rather than what we had on the surface, and their regulating and their cultural services they offered us. However, the Dutch had been through an industrial revolution, so unlike Ireland, where we were still, that top picture there is a gentleman cutting turf in Ireland using a slane. It's a traditional hand tool that we would have really used, and most families would have used right up into the 1970s and 80s in Ireland. We didn't begin our industrial development of our peatlands really until after the 1940s, after World War II, when our semi-state company Bord na Móna was established. So with that, the Netherlands, as you had industrialised your peatlands a lot sooner than Ireland, you were one of the first countries in Europe to really understand the consequences and the sense of the loss that we would experience with our peatland habitat through the development of the peatlands. So what is our country's lost? Well, there was a devastating decline in peatlands. there was about 8,000 hectares restorable in the Netherlands. Ireland is no different. We have today about 269,000 hectares of about 1.3 million hectares. So really in Ireland, we're looking at today over 1 million hectares of land, peatland, that needs restoration or rehabilitation. And I suppose over the past, 30 years, we've got such a greater understanding of the value of peatlands. In particular, a great focus at this time is on their value as a carbon store, where they sequester carbon and store that carbon. So from a climate change point of view, and I don't think this would have been spoke about back in the 1980s or 1990s. So they have a huge significance today, but both our countries have suffered losses. However, the Dutch government at the time in the 1970s, they took direct action and they made an inventory of your peatland habitat. They compulsory purchased it, they've developed management plans, and they began a restoration program and an education program around the value of peatlands. That didn't happen in Ireland really until we didn't start that until the 1990s, 2000s. In the 1990s, one of the first things the Irish Peatland Conservation Council did with funds from the Worldwide Fund for Nature is we campaigned for peatlands to be included on our national curriculum. Up until that point, so when I was in school, I learned one thing about a bog, when I was in the junior school, primary school, we called it in Ireland, and that was that you go to the bog to get turf. Turf is a domestic fuel that we burn in our fires. You go to the bog to collect milled peat to use to generate electricity. And just this weekend, one of our last remaining 3 peat burning power stations has closed in Ireland, which is a significant weekend to celebrate our Irish peatlands. It's called Shannon Bridge. It's been in operation for over 30 years. And today we are not burning peat in that power station anymore. And it's been a long time coming to do that. The Dutch also, when we look at it, they signed a joint cooperation agreement between the Irish government and your own government. And that was became formal in 1987. And that allowed direct access to Irish peatlands for members of the Dutch community, scientific community, to come to Ireland and to study our bogs. Now, at the time, Ireland was very naive, and we said to the Dutch people, we have loads of bogs, absolutely, come and study our peatlands. But again, we didn't understand the consequences of the exploitation that we had began back in 1946 on this industrial scale. But we were very fortunate in Ireland that one researcher would come, and his name is Matthias Schouten. Excuse my pronunciation of his name if I have it wrong, but Matthias is known as the father of peatland conservation in Ireland. He came as a researcher as part of this joint cooperation agreement between our 2 countries to understand peatlands. He started where we are now based at the Bog of Allen in Lullymore, and he was surprised to find that peatlands that the Irish had said are there and study them were being developed unknown to us, I suppose, at the time. On a visit to Clonmacnoise, he found Mongan Bog, and he contacted J.J. Moore in University College Dublin on a Sunday evening. He could see the diggers were ready to open up drains and to develop this peatland. And between them, they actually saved that bog. And that was really his inspiration to begin a campaign with his colleagues and his friends in the Netherlands. And they established the Dutch Foundation for the Conservation of Irish Peatlands at that time. And their aim was to have a campaign, 3 bogs in 3 years. And they managed it. They managed to raise awareness of the need for conservation in Ireland. His conversations in University College Dublin inspired the National Peatland Conservation Committee in the early 1980s, as I mentioned, which would later be formally established as the Irish Peatland Conservation Council. And what the Dutch people did for Ireland was, in the Netherlands, you fundraised in your own communities, and you raised enough money to come to Ireland with the help of the Irish Peatland Conservation Council and purchase 3 bogs. The image is quite small, but you can see the map of Ireland and the 3 locations: Schwa Bog in County Westmeath, Cummer River Bog in County Kerry, and part of Clonarnagon in County Galway. And what the Dutch people did for Ireland was you then handed these bogs back. So they're now today in the management of our nature conservation organisation, the National Parks and Wildlife Service. But ultimately you saved these bogs for the Irish people, and they were handed back to the Irish government. And it was the first time in the 1980s where the Irish government stood up and pledged to conserve a representative sample of Irish peatlands. They pledged at that meeting and that transfer of deeds to protect 40,000 hectares of blanket bog, which is a type of peatland we find in our uplands, in our mountainous areas, dominantly around the west coast of Ireland, but also in the Midlands and our Slieve Bloom Mountains, and in the east coast in the Wicklow. And also 10,000 hectares of raised bog habitat that we find dominantly in the Midlands of Ireland. These are the oldest bogs we have, 10,000 years, built of dead plant material and water. And as I said, as very shamefully in my interview, what did I know about the Dutch and Irish bog story was that both of our countries had peatlands. But you can see here, this is the exhibition that was prepared in my first year working with the charity. And it was a celebration of the 25 years since the Dutch and Irish joint cooperation. So it's been a very successful cooperation together, and it really has raised awareness of peatland habitat, to the extent that in Ireland today, as I mentioned, we have about 269,000 hectares of peatland in a restorable state. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to bring this bog into what we would call active peat formation, but we are in a much better position today thanks to the Dutch people. In 2016, I was very fortunate to visit Bog Restoration with my colleague, and our hosts at Bog Restoration were fantastic. They welcomed us with open arms, and they provided us with 2 days of fantastic exploration of the work that the Dutch people have completed in Bog Restoration. And I think when we came away from that, it was, we learned that so much about the restoration of peatlands in the Netherlands. And, one of the big things was water. Water is the blood of a bog, and it's really important. What we're going to do now is we're going to explore one of the methods of restoring peatland that the Irish Peatland Conservation Council have brought to Ireland from a conference we attended in Canada, and we're the first to bring it. And it is one of our campaign issues, is to encourage our government and landowners, private landowners, to implement this technique where appropriate. And that is the transfer of sphagnum moss onto Irish peatlands from a donor site. So as I mentioned, Ireland is similar position to the Netherlands, and we also have huge restoration projects to undertake. You get the picture of Ireland at the top there, this pristine open landscape, a hummock hollow system. So we have drier areas and wetter areas, this carpet of these sphagnum mosses. But in reality, you see an overview of Irish peatlands. This particular site here is a site that we have domestic turf cutting on, where we haven't opened the site on a large industrial scale. So we have many areas in Ireland where we have what we know is kind of these remnant, we still have the dome of the bog, but you can see at the edges, we're slowly cutting away, nibbling away at the edges of the bog year on, year out. And that's the reality. So to get our bogs back to active peat formation, we have restoration initiatives to undertake on them, very similar to what the Netherlands experienced in the 70s and 80s. Bog restoration is the re-establishment of the typical plants, including the sphagnum mosses, which we know as the bog formers, and the re-establishment to achieve the growth of these sphagnum mosses. It's all about the hydrology, the water in the bog. It's the lifeline, it's the blood of the bog, and that's a huge work that we need to undertake. The national parks in Ireland recently estimated that 1 million hectares of Irish peatlands needs to be either restored or rehabilitated, and one of the first things that involves is drain blocking, is re-establishing the hydrological function of our peatlands. And we've estimated that at a cost, or the national parks have estimated that as a cost of €1 billion to achieve. So much work has to be done in Ireland, but only recently €108 million has been made available for the restoration of some of our industrial, well, I should say the rehabilitation of our industrial landscape in Ireland. So a very significant move that we are putting significant investment into restoration and rehabilitation in Ireland today, but much work has to be done. As I said, we still burn peat in our power stations. A good weekend to see one of those power stations closing, but we still continue to do that. And huge concerns in the horticultural industry, the milling and mining of our bogs, for still the horticultural use in our peatlands as well. So the nature of a raised bog, so we're looking at the Midlands here of Ireland now, the oldest, 10,000 years old. It's water, peat and vegetation. Peat is dead plant material that has accumulated over thousands of years, and the vegetation, we're talking about the living layer of our peatland, and they are strongly interconnected, as you would know. This is sphagnum moss. We call it the bog builder in Ireland. It's a feature of an active raised bog habitat. And if we want to have peat formation and active peat formation, we need this sphagnum moss. It accumulates about 1 millimetre a year. It can be a depth down to 4 to 6 metres. And the key thing about encouraging sphagnum moss to actively grow is we need a water table within about 10 centimetres throughout the year on our peatland habitats, and we need it gently sloping. So we don't want, and this is some of the things that we learned from Bog as well in your own restoration, in that the slope of the site was really important on your restoration works as well. We don't want significant drops over areas. And we do need a continuous supply of water as well. But this is the key plant that we're trying to encourage to actively grow, to bring our bogs back to life. So as I mentioned, the technique we're going to talk a little bit about today is known as Sphagnum Transfer. It's not an Irish technique. It was developed in Quebec in Canada. You can see this acid bare peat as a starting point. One of the elements is we have large areas of these open brown landscapes in Ireland. These are industrial areas. You can see the drains that we have in them. One problem we have with sphagnum moss transfer in Ireland is that bogs are acidic in nature. Our peatlands started to form from shallow lakes, which were alkaline in nature. So the use of sphagnum moss on these industrial areas is really dependent on the depth of peat that has been extracted. So in many cases, what we found is that we've gone below that acidic layer, and that wouldn't be a good stand to introduce the sphagnum moss. So as I mentioned, we need a water table within about 10 centimetres, but we also need an acidic conditions to encourage. This is what we witnessed in Canada when we visited, is the difference in, if you do and have the right conditions, how the sphagnum moss can take hold on an area compared to an area with no restoration. Large areas of bare peat remain exposed. This can lead to erosion of that peat. It can continue to lead to, enter our water systems. Again, with the dryness on that area, you've now got carbon being released from these sites. So we really want to get that water table and get the sphagnum moss growing on these areas. So one of the first things that we have to do is, one, I suppose, look at the pH. So if the pH of the site is sufficient, we can begin then the use of sphagnum. But before we do that, we have to know that the water table, there's no point transplanting sphagnum onto a dry site. It stores over 10 times its own weight in water. It is dependent on water to grow. So one of the first things we do is we would identify drains on a site. This particular image here is of Lodge Bog, an area owned by the Irish Peatland Conservation Council in Kildare. We have chosen on our site to use this recycled plastic lumber. This is more expensive to use as a drain block. However, we didn't have the site that we're managing, Lodge Bog, is quite small. It's only 35 hectares. And we felt at the time, when evaluating the most appropriate method of drain blocking, that if we were to use peat dams, we would need to bring machinery into the bog. And we thought the size of the site, it was just too sensitive to allow machinery onto the reserve. And also to drain block, we felt it was really important to bring our supporters and use it as an education initiative. So we blocked 5 kilometres of drains internally on Lodge Bog. And you can see here one of our conservation officers who's now actually working on Peatlands in Canada, Killian. And he just demonstrating there how each piece of lumber was hammered into the bogs by hand in Lodge Bog. The second thing, once the drain is blocked, you now have to monitor the water table. As I said, you want to see a rise in water, and why it's so important is the only source of water a bog gets in Ireland, presuming it's similar in the Netherlands, is rainfall. So we get a lot of rain in Ireland, and that's what makes bogs ideal growth in our country. In the Midlands, we get about 700 millimetres a year. In the upland areas, we can have over 1,200 millimetres a year. So we actively monitor the water table using what we know as piezometers. These can be made very cheaply. They're simply a piece of plastic piping that you might have on a gutter. You drill holes in it. You put, very scientifically, a sock on the bottom of it, and we can hammer that into the bog. The sock prevents the peat from going up through the pipe, but the holes allow the water enter. So we can monitor the water tables. And once we have an adequate water table, we can then consider the use of sphagnum moss with those acidic conditions. So we can see here an area of bare peat. What we would first do is we would record the vegetation in that area. As I mentioned earlier, this bare peat is exposed to erosion. It's emitting carbon. It is, with erosion, it's entering our water systems, which is causing problems there as well. So what we do is we take a vegetation survey of the area and we profile it. So as we know, we don't want significant drops in the height of the peatland. So with that, by profiling it, we get an understanding of the lay of the land so that we can ensure that the sphagnum moss isn't going to roll downhill as soon as we get a shower of rain in Ireland. So with the profiling, we may have to do a bit of site levelling where we might have to take off some of that oxidized peat on the surface. The preferred choice of sphagnum that we use in Ireland is Sphagnum Capillafolium. We have over 10 different varieties of sphagnum, and why this one is chosen, it's a moderate peat forming peatland. It's common, but also it's more of a lawn sphagnum. So it's not one like cuspidatum that you find growing in the very wet areas of the bog. So it kind of lives halfway between areas. So we know that as the lawn. So not very dry at the hummocks or not in the water either. So it makes it the choice. And as we mentioned, it is common on our peatlands. So that this was the chosen one for our Sphagnum transfer. The Capillafolium, the collection of it, excuse me, there I just jumped ahead. So what we need for a 5 metre by 5 metre restoration plot, we dig 10 centimetre depth, and that would cover 50 centimetres by 50 centimetres. You can see it here. We're identifying it on the site. We're measuring out our half metre by half metre quadrat. We're taking not the whole site, you're taking 10 centimetres of the surface. The donor site you can see there, it will regenerate within a year. So monitoring of that site is very important as well to it. The spores are left there. Although we're taking that living layer, there is still that bank of spores. So that's why we're not going down, right down over, a metre into the bog. You want that bank of spores remaining so that the site can recover within a year. And we can see regeneration on the site on the donor site, I should say, within a year. The Sphagnum Capillafolium collected, we can just see here in brief, if we have our area, this is one of our trial areas on Lodge Bog. With that, we did the profile. So we had to do a little bit of leveling to remove the oxidized peat on it. The sphagnum then is spread over the area, and straw is covered on that area. And that's kind of to create a little microclimate, to give an opportunity for the sphagnum to take hold in this area, but also it retains moisture. So it does help at drying out, particularly if you're doing this in early spring and you're entering into the summer season, where we can get some prolonged periods, not very often, I should say, in Ireland, of dry weather. This straw does help it, for that first year. This is one of our other sites. It's Gurley Bog in County Meath. This was also a site that was purchased with Dutch funding in 2013. Gurley Bog is 100 hectares in size. It is a natural heritage area in Ireland, and that's an Irish designation under the Irish Wildlife Act here in Ireland. And part of the reserve is also a special area of conservation, and that's obviously you'd be familiar with those from the European Habitats Directive. Back in 2013, 2012, I suppose, the Irish Peatland Conservation Council were contacted by the National Parks and Wildlife Service. There was one last remaining turf cutter on the reserve, so he was actively cutting turf on it. He had been approached to purchase the MPWS to purchase the site, but the turf cutter at the time wasn't willing to sell. But in the height of the recession, we don't need to talk about the bust that Ireland went through from 2008, but in the height of the recession, the turf cutter was willing to sell the last section of the bog. The Irish Peatland Conservation Council established a symbolic share, very similar to how Matthias and the Dutch Foundation raised the funding for the three reserves to purchase and gift to the Irish people in the 1980s. And this reserve people will donate. So for a quarter of an acre, you can get, for €45, you can get, a symbolic share in Irish peatlands. Obviously, for €45, you can't buy a bog. So this is in a restricted fund in the Irish Peatland Conservation accounts, where we build up that fund, and it's used then to purchase peatlands that are directly under threat. And in this case, it was seen that to conserve, although we only bought 8.5 hectares of the reserve back in 2013, by our purchase of this area on the reserve, it secured the 100-hectare reserve for the people of Ireland. So we did part of that. 2.83 hectares was cut bog, where the turf had been cut from. So we monitored we completed drain blocking. We knew we had acidic peat. Once the water table was in around 10 centimetres, we were able to transfer sphagnum. So you can see an area of bare peat just around a pool area. We transferred the sphagnum, and you can see the results after 3 years. The area around that site now is got a nice complement of sphagnum moss on it. And again, just to say again that this site was 50% of the funding for this reserve was donated to the Irish Peatland Conservation Council by the Dutch Foundation for the conservation of Irish bogs. So it's just another example of how our two countries are continuing to work together today. There are problems with the harvesting of, the sphagnum moss transfer. As you can imagine, flooding. We get a lot of rain in Ireland, and in many times where we've tried the sphagnum moss transfer, it's been areas of what we know as old spreading grounds. So where turf would have been laid out in the past. And what we found is that if the land is quite compacted, it can lead to flooding and too much kind of oxidized peat, maybe not being or being removed at that initial profiling stage. So we do have to be careful that we don't dig down too much into the peat. And also then we can suffer drought. In 2018, we had a very significantly very dry year, and that causes problems as well, especially for the establishment of the sphagnum moss. But in terms of the timeline, first off, in days and weeks, we're improving the physical condition of the peatlands. Then we're looking to improve the chemical condition. Months and years, it's the improvement of the biological condition, and years and decades, it's topographical condition of the reserve. Restoration, as you know, in the Netherlands, it takes time. We can do the work, but it is nature and time that is needed. So patience in restoration and rehabilitation of our peatlands is really important. This talk today was really a snapshot into sphagnum transfer. It was a means of highlighting the strong connection between the Dutch and Irish, and I'm happy to say that connection is still ongoing today. We actually hosted in 2018 a visit to Schwa Bog. Matthias joined us down on Schwa Bog in County Westmeath, one of these sites that was protected by the Dutch funding back in the 1980s. I'd like to thank you for inviting me to be part of your Peatlands and your celebrations today in the Netherlands. One thing that has happened with COVID-19 is that we can open up, and it's amazing to think that I'm here in Ireland speaking and talking with you many miles away in the Netherlands. So I want to thank you for inviting the Irish Peatland Conservation Council to be part of your day, and wish you every success in the rest of the day, because I know it's only midday yet, but I think we're leaving time to allow for some questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand back to Leonie there.
Well, Nuala, thank you very much for your reading. I'm very happy to have you here today. It's a very interesting story. I really liked our shared bog history, and I couldn't believe my ears that the Irish bogs are still being cut and burned. So I'm very glad that the IPCC is there to protect them. You are badly needed, and there is so much work to do. Our audience has given some questions. The first one is from Jantien. She asked, is it possible for individual landowners to obtain money for restorations of their bog that is now being used for private peat harvesting?
So a lot of the peatland, how the kind of ownership of bogs in Ireland works is back in the 1930s, a lot of our peatland in the industrial scheme would have been compulsory purchased by the state to begin our industrial process. So at the moment in Ireland, Bord na Móna, our semi-state body, own about 80,000 hectares of peatland, which isn't kind of a significant amount when you think of 1.3 million hectares of peatland that we have. Most of Irish peatlands is still in the remaining of private ownership. Traditionally in Ireland, how the land was divided up was families were given turbary rights. So when you built a house, you were given a turbary right on the peatland that you could go and get your fuel from that bog. So as I mentioned about Gurley Bog, what we did there was it's 100 hectares, and the last remaining turf cutter owned like a slice of the cake. take 8.5 hectares of it. So a lot of the bogland, now Quilshire, our state forestry, owns another 88,000 hectares. We then have, you know, the MPWS owning some of it, but many of the sites that we have conserved in Ireland are not in the ownership of the state. They're actually owned by private individuals. So in terms of restoration, in peatlands that we have conserved as special areas of conservation, these are the ones we're focusing first on. These are obviously the best examples of peatland habitat in Ireland, and they've been designated as such under the European Habitats Directive. What we're doing in Ireland to support turf cutters, because we did make it illegal to cut turf. So families who would have traditionally had the right to cut turf on a special area of conservation, it's now illegal to do so, and this allows the state to be able to begin the restoration work of drain blocking on these reserves. So we have a compensation scheme in place. The turf cutters were offered 3 options. One is they could stop cutting turf, and the turf, if some people said, look, it's not about money for me, it's about the use of turf. I'm 70, I'm 80, I have always burnt turf and I want to continue to do that. So they have been offered the potential to stop cutting turf on the reserve that's protected, and on an area that is considered non-conservation worthy importance in that we cannot conserve it, is that we've offered relocation packages to those turf cutters. Other people have said, look, I'm more about the money. And in that case, families were offered €1,500 a year to stop cutting turf, and that was spread over 15 years. Ireland, we don't get extreme winters, so the €1,500 is not just as an alternative fuel source, it's about insulation. A big driver is, you know, the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, and looking at our homes in Ireland and how we can improve their energy efficiency. So many of our homes were built many years ago, and they would have large open fires, you know, very little insulation in our attics and our walls. So the extra funding that was given as part of this is for the insulation of our homes as well. And then other people were like, look, I just want to use turf. So again, they didn't want a relocation site, but they were given the option to get turf delivered to their homes. So that's the only compensation that's been given to private landowners to stop cutting turf, and they're not really you know, directly responsible for the restoration of that reserve. The state is taking responsibility for that. So at the moment, we have, just coming to an end, the first of the 12 special areas of conservation that received funding under the LIFE project. You'll be familiar with this funding through the EU. And 12 of our raised bogs are, just as I said, have been involved for the past 3 years in this funding programme. We have another LIFE project beginning. You know, it's going to be a lot longer. It's over 8 years, and it's working on blanket bog habitat. So the funding is coming from Europe through the Competitive Life project. Also in Ireland, we all pay a carbon tax on our fuel. So the funding from the carbon tax is now going into a scheme for restoration as well. So that would be another method. But individuals who wouldn't necessarily be responsible for the restoration. One of the things that has happened is a lot more community groups are establishing. So where community would have a bog in their local area, they are now taking direct action. We have estimated to restore all of the bogs in Ireland on the time frame that the government is working on. It will take over 200 years. So what we find in Ireland is local community groups are now taking, you know, getting established where they want to explore their bogs, they want to learn about their bogs. And one of the roles that the Irish Peatland Conservation Council hope to be able to do is education on the variety of restoration methods, to educate them on how to profile a drain, how to block a drain, what are their options for that, and in turn they might fundraise locally or apply to different government schemes on a local level where they may be able to restore their peatlands from their own particular local site. So that's kind of how the peatlands are working. I hope that answers your question.
I think so. Thank you very much. I've another question from Martijn. Are the Schwagner mosses also used to stabilize the water table to the 10 centimeter fluctuations? And are there also examples of where sphagnum mosses regenerated by themselves?
Yes, so we would find that on Lodge Bog. First off, sphagnum moss is really important because what it does is it holds the water on the bog. So the purpose of transferring sphagnum moss onto a bare area of bare peat is that if we don't have the sphagnum moss there in the first place, the water is just going to run off the site, and that's what's causing the erosion. So the sphagnum moss is there to absorb the water and hold the water on the bog. So it has a real key role in that. The second element there of, can it establish on itself? Yes, it can. We have done on, there will be spores on the reserve. And what we've done is when we've done our drain blocking on Lodge Bog, we've witnessed that where the sphagnum mosses, especially where you've got the open water filling the drain, especially this, we call it drowned kitten or cuspidatum, has began to infill these drains. But it's the areas of bare peat where you don't really have that spore bank for it to actually re-establish. And that's the purpose of the sphagnum moss transfer. It's really to give nature a helping hand and to speed up the process of the growth or the re-establishment of sphagnum mosses under the right conditions. So where you have a drain and you have the vegetation on the surface, yes, the sphagnum moss will come in because it's in the surrounding area. But the transfer is often done on areas that have been cut. So what first happened there is that the living layer has been taken away. So you're really dealing with sphagnum moss transfer on areas of bare peat where there's no sphagnum moss to come on, or it's going to take a lot greater amount of time for it to re-establish on those reserves.
Well, thank you for this, Nuala. One last question from Esther. She asked, in the Netherlands, it has been very difficult to re-establish the proper hydrological conditions for peat because the remaining bogs are so small and only have a thin peat layer left. How's this going in Ireland? What would you recommend us?
Yeah, so I suppose with the Irish as well, is the re-establishment of the hydrological conditions is a very important part of it. When you have shallow peat, it can be difficult, especially without the sphagnum mosses. We need to follow the procedure in terms of identifying your drains, measuring the depth of them, the width of them, to know the drain blocking, and choosing then the drain blocking. In an area of shallow peat, you might not have the donor peat available to use peat dams. So it might be a consideration as looking at alternative of the plastic lumber might be an option there. And that would preserve the peat in the area around it. And then of course, looking at maintaining the water. So is the sphagnum mosses there? What is the pH of this area with shallow peat? Is it still alkaline? Is it still acidic in nature? So we do need to consider that as well. Is that, you know, is the pH correct for it to become, you know, a peatland, or would it be more appropriate that you have maybe shallow pools to store that carbon in the peat? So when we look at restoration, it is complex. It can be achieved, but we do need to look and follow the procedures and best practice guidelines. Here in Ireland, our National Parks and Wildlife Service have set about a suite of best practice guidelines for the restoration of peatlands that we must we should follow. And again, in the Netherlands, you have your long established experience of this as well. But in terms of shallow peat, you're really looking at what's the pH of it. First, is it going to be potential to encourage sphagnum onto the reserve? Is it what method of drain blocking are you going to look at? You might not have, as I mentioned, the donor peat, so considering alternative methods of drain blocking in that case. And where you can, if the pH, if the water table is correct, maybe consider the sphagnum moss transfer if you have that donor sphagnum available to you. But yes, I think we would find the on the cut peatlands of Ireland, similar to Gurley Bog, is the depth of peat remaining on that area ranges from about 2 meters to 5 meters in depth. So we get varying depths. So one thing that we encouraged and we've spoke about is the contouring of the land that remains as well, that you don't leave areas of bare peat exposed and create shallow pools in other areas. So lots to kind of think about there. I'm hoping that's given you some little tips.
Yeah, thank you very much.